So our next GrimmCon presenter, Stephen Fox, an old friend. I haven't seen him in years. Awesome guy. He leads governance, risk, and compliance for the state of Washington. His background includes learning how to break systems as a penetration tester, using that knowledge to protect organizations as a security architect, and managing GRC and audit practices in the private and public sectors.
Yeah, so Stephen's session is going to deconstruct supply chain risk into two components. So you have the infrastructure component, and this is like the IT and service environment, which the supply chain factors can act on. And then you have the value chain. This is the flow of interactions between users and data, and the infrastructure component that generates value for both the consumer and third parties.
So Stephen joins us live to present his talk, Deconstructing Supply Chain Risk. Thank you for joining us, Stephen. Take it away. Oh, you're muted, Stephen. Don't want to miss a word.
Yep. Thank you so much for having me, and welcome to GrimmCon. I hope you guys are having a wonderful time. I'm really happy to be here. So we're going to deconstruct the whole idea of supply chain, as was already introduced. Let's go ahead and move on. So, of course, the requisite disclaimer, seeing as I do work for the state of Washington, this presentation reflects my opinions only and does not communicate the position of Washington Technology Services or the state of Washington. So that out of the way, let's move on. So CISA did a survey last year of 1,300 IT leaders and found some major IT concerns. Ransomware was one of the top issues. A lot of these stats are very familiar to you. What's interesting, though, is there's way more to supply chain than software. So some non-IT incidents that happened in 2021. So during the winter of 2021, there were some power outages in Texas that impacted the ability of food distributors to control their logistics. That actually led to food shortages across the state of Texas. Again, totally unrelated to software. Coronavirus, as we're hopefully getting out of the major part of it this year, impacted manufacturers in India, and that actually impacted iPhone and oxygen tank production during the whole year. And lastly, frequent wildfires throughout the Pacific Northwest impacted California's logistic network due to clogged and cut off freight lines. So there's way more to this stuff than whether you have a vulnerability to certain software events. So today we're going to be talking about how to use information outside of software to manage your supply chain risk, and applying the idea of value chain analysis, which is a tool that comes from ITIL. I'm sure ITIL is familiar to some of you, and I'm going to end it with some calls to action. So a definition of supply chain management, what we're really trying to do is establish a systematic way to identify our vulnerabilities and threats that are coming through sources that are outside of our direct control. And that's what's really key here, is we need to understand how the people that we rely on to give us something that we can't do ourselves, to mitigate the risk of giving up that level of control, and how deep down the rabbit hole that goes. That's one of the major challenges, especially in software supply chain, is how deep do you have to go to all these vendors to figure out what is my risk and how, at what point do I stop tracking the vendors of vendors of vendors. So the overall risk management process, of course, establish the proper governance, figure out who your critical suppliers are, which is a lot easier said than done. Assess the risk of those critical suppliers and mitigate risk. I wish it were that easy. So some of the tools that NIST has provided, 800-161, there's a supply chain risk management framework out there, which we'll cover briefly. 839, the enterprise risk management framework. 830, it looks at risk assessment, and ISO 31000 actually borrowed some of the concepts for itself. And from a more practice perspective, NIST IR 7622 is also useful. So this overview gives you a sense of what the 161 framework provides, going through framing the risk across the organization, going through the process of analyzing the risk, monitoring, and then choosing what to do about it. As I alluded to earlier, we have the scope of that framework happening within the organization and guiding how we interact with our suppliers. The challenge is figuring out how deep down the hierarchy you have to go to really capture the salient points of your risk. And that's where the value chain analysis is a tool to figure out how deep you have to go. And that's a very powerful thing to do. And NIST IR 7622 provides a way of more operationally delving into risk analysis for moderate and high systems. So it really it communicates that, hey, we acknowledge this is hard. You need to focus on the really high risks in order to go through all these procedures. But again, these are just suggestions on what to do. You don't really know what's at risk and how to communicate that to the organization. And that's where I've seen a lot of organizations fall down, is communicating risk in a manner which matters to your business stakeholders. In short, these frameworks do not identify value at risk. And that's where value chain analysis is a tool to do that. So here we have a high-level perspective of the value of the service value system framework that ITIL has. So you've got your demand, the opportunity that your customers have, the thing that actually makes you money. And there's guiding principles, which I will not cover here because it's a whole other presentation, which you can research, of course, governance. And we're going to dive into the service value chain here. And that value chain generates value for your internal customer, but also for the customers that give you revenue. And lastly, there's continual improvement. So diving into the actual value chain, again, we're familiar with demand and value. The engaged component is your interactions with your stakeholders, both within the organization and outside, to define actually what the nature of the demand is, what the need is, and the value you're delivering within the organization and to your customers. The plan is what is it you're going to do as an organization to deliver on that value? How are you going to improve upon that over time? And acknowledging the resources it takes to do that. The design and transition, these are all the steps and technologies to ensure that what you're producing is a product or a service meets expectations for quality and cost. The obtain and build, this is where you decide whether you're going to develop that within the organization or partner with a solutions provider. And delivery and support, ensure that you're actually producing this service or product in a manner which will satisfy your customers. Now, that's a very complicated picture, and McKinsey & Company collapsed this into an easier thing to use for the identification and management of risk. Give me. And we're going to use this process in an example that we'll go into shortly. Now, the idea here is to identify where the loss of value or the risk falls in the different components of the value chain. The power of this is it gives you a way to communicate with your stakeholders to understand the business value that could be lost under certain risk scenarios. It allows you to communicate that to management in a language that they understand, and will aid you to get budget. So we're going to look at a SaaS offering here. We're going to use the value chain that McKinsey produced to look at the actual touch points, and we're going to look at where we might want to monitor things and have controls in place to mitigate the risk. So first, we're going to set the context of what we're dealing with. What is it? What value are we providing to the customer? We're going to identify the critical business functions we're trying to address in terms of risk management. So we have a SaaS offering. I'm not going to go into details, but just picture a generic SaaS offering. The planning, of course, the governance team and the development teams are going to get together and say, we have this value proposition for our customers. We need to work with you, development team, to produce this. Then we're going to source this to internal development teams, but also we want to provide this as a cloud offering, so we need to have co-location data centers engaged to make that available to our customers. To make the internal portion of it, we need to work with internal development, cloud operations, and security operations. So all these teams are now gathering together to provide this service or value to the customer. We're going to work with external partners, developers, and data centers to customize this to our customers. So you can picture this SaaS offering as a blank slate, which is then customized for a particular customer. And then we're going to use APIs and data centers to make this available to the customer. Now you can, if you're already thinking ahead here, you can already find areas where we could disrupt the delivery of that information to the customer. So we're going to actually look at the areas where we could lose value or really identify the actual risk to that value. Identify where these events could occur, where they actually matter, and that's going to actually tell us how far down the rabbit hole to go. We're going to analyze the threats and what weaknesses those segments have. So here we have, so at the planning stage, the biggest risk here is loss of intellectual capital and experience that will impact our ability to plan a good product and make it resilient against our threats. At the source area, we have data center risks to make this available. So are the data centers ready to respond to attacks? And how do we minimize the odds of a service outage that originates at the data center? For the internal make portion, are we managing our software dependency risks, which many of us are familiar with from other talks in this space? But one thing a lot of customizable solutions don't think of is that partner component or partners being trained to mitigate that risk. So that's another risk here is, do our partners know how to make their configurations secure and resilient? And delivery risk would be denial of service, API security risks, and software and service outages. So how do we actually respond to this? So security awareness, being aware of the fact these things occur, but how to mitigate, transfer, or avoid those risks, and how to respond when the value chain is attacked. So here we're looking at, looking at things to mitigate the actual risk that we've already identified. On the loss of intellectual capital side, we will look at monitoring people leaving or people not keeping up with their trainings. For the sourcing side, we will look at things such as tracking SOC 2 reports or doing on-site audits to be sure that the data center is operating as expected. On the software dependency side, we would look at tracking software licenses and making sure that the software dependencies are tested. And we also provide automated testing through our CI/CD pipeline. For the configuration risk, you would have to require partner training and recertification to ensure that the partners are doing what they have to do to provide for the service, but also having the appropriate security controls on the delivery end to mitigate the risk. Now, all these things have to be monitored. So we delve further with the use of this pipeline. So we have key risk indicators. It's really hard to do continuous risk assessments. So we would use key risk indicators at key portions in the value chain to monitor the risk. So in the plan, you will look at things like turnover rate KPIs. At the source end, you would look at data center key control indicators, such as have they gone through a recent SOC 2? Did the SOC 2 have any deficiencies reported, whether minimal or significant? You will also look at key risk indicators in terms of your monitoring of the data center's functionality. On the make side, you will look at software dependencies, key control indicators, making sure that you're only using validated source libraries, and those have been tested. So you're looking at the testing performance indicators, as well as KPIs around partner training and review. And you would leverage security metrics as well as internal audit metrics to ensure that your delivery mechanisms are being monitored. So some best practices here. ZTA, I know that for the public sector, that's coming up really soon. We're going through the process of redefining our policy stack to align with the upcoming CTA architectural requirements, but also trying to transform the culture to align with ZTA behaviors. Doing third-party governance to communicate the use of these value chains to negotiate contracts with your vendors, which would be a departure from what I've seen done commonly out there. Identifying your attack surface and monitoring it, using a data encryption And I know that in the public sector, that can be very challenging. But depending on the actual private sector applications, it can also be something that meets with some heated debate. And of course, there's incident response planning targeted to the key value chain areas. So it's easy to manage risks that you know about. It's harder to handle the ones you don't know about. So here you really need to focus on the traditional layers of defense and use key risk indicators and KPIs across the value chain. Now, another use of the value chain here would be to identify, okay, I have key value segments along that chain. What do I need to monitor for unknown risks that would pop up in terms of a KCI or KPI? And that will give you a sense of, hey, something happened here that I didn't anticipate. We should follow up on that. So calls to action for you, work with your business stakeholders to create these value chain maps around some existing risk scenarios that you already have in your risk teams. That's going to be challenging. I definitely recommend that you refer to the ITIL 4 library to do that. But many of the risk categories and risk process within NIST map very well to the ITIL value chain. So it is doable. It just takes some adapting. Communicate the reliability of the supply chain controls that you come up with to your stakeholders to build trust. That's going to be your key thing to enable part one, is you need to build trust with your stakeholders. Thirdly, engage with your risk owners, bring them these ITIL risk maps to help them understand, okay, this is where I need to chip in. This is what I'm going to be held accountable to. And lastly, recommend the risk indicators that you can deliver on, that you have technologies to monitor and map those to the value chain. So that is the end of the presentation. Are there any questions?
Great.
Okay.
Thank you, Stephen. You missed my announcement. Wait a minute. I hear it. It's live Q&A or Ask Stephen Anything. Actually, I was thinking about a riff on that and call it Grill Stephen, but yeah. Ashley, I know you had a question.
Well, at least I was saying, what does the fox say, you know?
Absolutely. It's kind of funny, interesting that this is your topic, because I was actually having a conversation the other day with some people about supply chain, and one of the biggest things that we were discussing is, how do you go about validating cybersecurity for supply chain vendors? And we kind of brought up, an idea, well, maybe, you could request like a letter of attestation from their most recent pen test or things like that. But, you can't tell them necessarily like, hey, go have a pen test done or do that. So how do you validate those things? How do you make sure that, you could be doing everything right for cybersecurity, and then something happens because you have a third party vendor? So how do you go about doing that?
Well, a lot of it is you need to do a lot of that work during your due diligence phase. You need to talk with previous customers that are within your, use them as a proxy for your company, if you will, and try to get from them how successful this vendor has been at delivering on their requirements. But a lot of this really is on you to communicate what you expect from them, and then figure out, okay, what do I need to see from them to give me a warm fuzzy around, okay, they can deliver on that. And how do I monitor that? And the hard part will be putting this into the contract. In my previous roles, negotiating the contract with the vendor has been where you really put those requirements of monitoring in there, and they always push back, especially the cloud vendors don't want to reveal what's in their black box. So you have to figure out, okay, what's coming out of that box that I have to monitor, and what can I extrapolate as something that I can push back on. Saying, hey, I'm seeing this performance indicator that doesn't really match up with what you committed to in terms of an SLA or behavior or control that they covered in their security offering. They need to have the courage to say you are not living up to your contract.
Awesome.
So that's a recommendation I have.
Okay, perfect. How do is there like a set of like good guidelines or something like that especially when you're talking specifically in like the realm of like industrial control systems, how do you look at doing vetting of your third parties, vetting of your supply chain, right? I know that in the past, like I've been able to participate in like, factory acceptance testing and site acceptance testing and things like that. Can you request those, those reports from the vendor? Can you look at that kind of stuff? Like what particularly, should people be looking at when they're looking at supply chain?
Well, in terms of ICT, I know CISA just came out with a template to do supply chain risk management. And depending on whether the supplier is operating within a critical service area for the state, I mean, this is more on the public side, but many of the critical infrastructure providers are also private sector. So you can bring the force of critical infrastructure requirements to compel the vendor to be more transparent.
Okay.
So that would be very particular to ICT environments and just in critical infrastructure in general. But if it's outside of that could be harder. You really have to understand what value you're trying to extract from the vendor and trying to compel them, okay, if you want our business, you have to give us this. And if you don't, be ready to move on to someone else.
Yeah, absolutely. And then is there a general kind of guidance for, looking at how many vendors for one particular service or offering, how many should you compare before making a decision? What's that kind of sample set look like?
So that's a great question. I'm not aware of any recommended guidance, but I will say that when we've evaluated penetration testing vendors, for example, we've gone as high as evaluating 30 or more people or companies that met certain criteria. So we would put out the RFQ, and we would get responses from, say, 50, and we would whittle that down to 25 or 30, and then go through a formal criteria evaluation, leveraging various people from within our organization to select the smaller group to be evaluated by procurement.
Okay.
But there the key is to have a standard set of criteria, because you are drawing from a large set of stakeholders in the organization across the value chain to say, well, would you hire this person? So you need to have common criteria to do that.
Oh, you said the words.
That is available through CISA.
Yeah.
You just said common criteria. That's almost a swear word. Sorry. But
No.
You mentioned a NIST IR earlier, and I didn't catch the number. Could you describe more about the stage that it's in, the maturity and any acceptance that you've been seeing?
So we're actually in the state of Washington. We are using that to guide evaluation of high impact systems. And I know when I was at IRS, we used that as well. So that's been around for a while. But it's a good procedural thing to look at high impact systems.
Fantastic. That's
any questions online? Please get them in now so we can include them here. Oh, hey, what do you know?
Oh yeah, here we go. So Joyo has a question. How has work from home or zero trust changed how identities or credentials are managed?
Wow, great question. Wish I could answer that. I'm not. This wasn't really a talk specific around IAM. Sorry, really not in a position to answer that question.
Who has ChatGPT open? Can we...
Right.
I'm sure we could get an excellently formed answer with about 60% accuracy.
Yeah. I love supply chain, conversations, because I think that it's something that really hasn't, it's kind of always been like in that background, right? It's always, everybody's always kind of thrown that like buzzword around, but it hasn't been until recently where we're really seeing the impact of supply chain issues. We're seeing major corporations, major companies that are, having to disclose these hacks and these attacks and everything. And it's like, oh, well, how did they get it? Oh, well, it was some third party system that was connected to their system. It wasn't even them. It was something else. And I think that that's really kind of bringing this into the light and bringing it forward. So it's a great conversation to have.
The conversation plays into both sides of the world. One, intentional adversarial attacks on supply chain, but also just the impacts of breaking supply chain, but the inability of, through whatever means, maybe it's a cyber attack, maybe it's COVID, a viral attack, causing us to not be able to get things, or to have to change up what we're including in our products along the way. We've seen it here at GRIMM in a number of different cases over the last couple of years, and I've seen some hacking tools having to actually change how they're built to get chips that they're able to actually source, or that they trust, and that's another big question.
Yeah, for me, the biggest source of some of these problems is that when architects are coming up with a solution to a problem within the organizations or a developer, they're not thinking, okay, how will this be used? How will this stand up to the pressures of business requirements and the amount of traffic that will be hit by this, or unexpected events within the business? How will it grow with an organization pursuing new opportunities? Because they're not part of those discussions. So I was thinking of a way to insert that team into those conversations by saying, okay, well, if I'm not being invited to the boardroom, I'm going to show up for the boardroom and sit in the back seat and listen, and start to create those maps and work with my management to say, hey, here's how the current design is going to impact your business. What do you guys think? Before you actually implement anything, using that supply chain, the value chain tool to create those maps that you can have those conversations in an effective, productive way before you go through the trouble of coding or building the architecture. And I have seen that successful in the private sector, and I'm working to implement that in the public sector right now.
So do you think that there's a kind of a culture change that has to happen with the way that we handled supply chain before, and how we need to handle supply chain moving forward?
I would say yes because I was at the CISA conference last week, and there was a lot of talk about the problem, but very few people were talking about solutions. We're all very aware of the issue, but we're not identifying the fact that we aren't even trying to come up with potential solutions. Is value chain the only solution? Probably not. But it's an attempt to get us somewhere that we're not at right now. So it is a cultural change from the perspective of us being ready to expand our area of influence and not waiting for permission to do so. Having a tool, being bold, and getting out there and doing the work it takes to understand their language and saying, hey, I'm here to help me understand what you're doing so I can help you be more secure.
So what you're saying actually brings up another thing that's been on my mind. These discussions internal to an organization can lead to a great deal of internal politicking or just missed communication. Can you share any insights or even anecdotes, stories that you've run into, and possibly a good positive outcome?
Well,
the positive outcome isn't required. You can tell the story either way.
Part of it is political awareness, and that applies in anywhere you go. I will say that when I started my career, I had developed this software, a small program that accelerated my productivity by 45%. It was amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And then I implemented it, and I made a mess of everything upstream. And I upset a lot of managers that had certain investments in the status quo. And I almost lost my job over it. Even though I had made an improvement in my area, I didn't understand the political sensitivity of what impact my change would have in other areas of the business that were providing me with inputs. If I had taken the time to form alliances with management to help me understand that overall supply chain, I would have known to at least propose it to a broader audience rather than just a dev team. Because the dev team were like, whoa, dude, that's great. Go ahead and do it.
We saved 2.3 nanoseconds. Obviously, push it. Yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
So it sounds like... Go ahead.
That would be it is it's an uncomfortable thing for people that aren't business people to have those conversations.